The two great mules stood like gray stones in the heat, their work done for the day. Before them, where a suffocating green blanket had lain for a generation, the earth was bare, dark, and breathing. And from that earth rose a circle of cut granite, a deep stone channel, and a massive press screw, thick as a man's thigh, pointing a rusted iron finger at the blank blue sky. It was a thing no one living had seen. A ghost, resurrected. Salt, the lighter of the two beasts, shifted his weight and lipped at the cool rim of the stone basin, his whiskers dripping. Pepper, dark as iron slag, merely watched the woman, Ilara, as she ran a hand, rough as a cob, over the chiseled stone. The air smelled of crushed leaves, damp soil, and something else. Something ancient and cedary. A scent memory locked in the rock itself. It had worked. The town had called it her folly. Now it had a new name, one only she and the mules and the stone knew. 2 years earlier, the name had been simpler. It was Lot 7, the Hemlock Hollow parcel, 110 acres of unsaleable Kudzu-Drowned land that came up last at the county auction. The auctioneer, a man named Biddle with a waistcoat too tight for his ambitions, didn't even bother trying to sell it. He just announced it, a joke to end the day. And finally, the old Hemlock place, 110 acres more or less, mostly more. Comes with a free and everlasting supply of Georgia vine, a healthy population of copperheads, and the ghost of the man who lost it. Do I hear $1 for the ghost? A dry chuckle went through the dozen or so farmers gathered in the courthouse dust. They were men who knew land, and this wasn't land. It was a problem. It was a green ocean that had swallowed a valley, a house, a barn, and a man's hope, leaving nothing but rolling leafy waves. $50, a voice said, clear and steady. The chuckle died. Every head turned. Ilara Kane stood by the door, a woman spare and quiet as a winter tree. She was alone, as she always was, having come to this county a year prior, with little more than 2 mules, 3 patched quilts, and a silence that folks mistook for meekness. They saw a woman in her late 20s with no husband, no family, and no sense. Sterling, the grain dealer who had just bought 300 prime acres of river-bottom land, laughed outright. $50 for a green nightmare. Girl, you'd do better to throw the money in the river. At least the fish might get some use of it. Ilara's gaze didn't flicker. She looked at the auctioneer. $60, she said, her voice carrying the same calm weight. Biddle blinked, surprised to be conducting an actual transaction. $60 from the lady. $60 for the kudzu farm. Any other fools in the room? The silence was thick with pity and scorn. Sold, Biddle said, slamming his gavel with a thud that felt more like a burial than a sale. To the woman with more money than sense, for $60. As Ilara counted out the worn bills, Sterling sidled up, his smile slick with false concern. Now, miss, you listen to me. A place like that, it's no place for a woman alone. It'll swallow you whole. I'd be willing to take it off your hands, call it a lesson learned, give you 20 for the deed. She folded her receipt, tucked it into the pocket of her worn dress, and looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were the color of a cloudy sky, revealing nothing. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Sterling, she said, her tone level, but I believe I'll keep my lesson. She walked out of the courthouse, the deed to 110 acres of ruin in her pocket, and did not look back. The town watched her go, a solitary figure leading her 2 enormous mules toward the green hills, and they all agreed she had surely lost her mind. The first task was not to fight the kudzu, but to understand it. The men of the valley saw it as a singular, monstrous entity, a green tide. Ilara, in her quiet way, saw it as a million individual plants, each with a root, a crown, and a hunger for light. It was a problem of arithmetic, not brute force. She and the mules made their camp on the very edge of the property, on a spit of land too rocky for even the vine to colonize. The first week was spent walking the perimeter, her hand trailing over the dense wall of leaves, feeling the heat that rose from its breathing surface. She found the path of the old road by the unnatural straightness of its depression under the green quilt. She found the creek by its sound, a muffled gurgle somewhere deep in the tangle. Old Mr. Anselm, her only neighbor to the east, came to watch her on the third day. He was a German immigrant who had carved a tidy farm from the stony hillsides decades before, a man whose hands were gnarled into the shape of the rocks he'd cleared. He stood leaning on a hickory staff, his blue eyes faded but missing nothing. He didn't offer pity or advice, just observation. "It has a heart," he said finally, his voice a low, accented rumble. Ilara stopped her pacing and looked at him. "A root crown," she corrected gently. "Big as a wagon wheel, some of them." He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "Nine. A heart. A place it wants to be most. You kill the heart, the arms die." He pointed with his staff toward the center of the valley. "It came from the railroad cut, they say, for the erosion. It did its job too well." He watched her mules, who were placidly stripping the leaves from the outermost vines, their powerful jaws working with a steady rhythm. "They will help, but they cannot dig. The heart is for you." He turned to leave, then stopped. "The land remembers what it was meant to be, Fräulein Kane. Under all this green noise, you only have to be quiet enough to listen." It was the most profound encouragement she had ever received, and it became her compass. She would not wage a war. She would perform a patient surgery. The work began at dawn, before the sun crested the ridge and turned the valley into a steam bath. The mules were the vanguard. Salt and Pepper, beasts of immense size and gentle temperament, were her partners. She had fitted them with heavy leather collars and a logging chain attached to a thick iron ring. She would wade into the green sea, her scythe swinging in a low, steady arc, clearing a space until she could loop the chain around a thicket of mature vines. Then, with a quiet word, heave. The mules would lean into their collars. There was no sudden jerk, only an immense, slow tightening. The ground would groan. Roots would pop and tear with sounds like pistol shots muffled in cotton. A great section of the vine, sometimes 30 feet long, would be ripped from its mooring, exposing the pale, starved earth beneath. Day after day, the arithmetic continued. A 10-foot strip, then another. The townsfolk who rode past on the county road would sometimes stop and watch. "Like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup," one of them remarked to another, loud enough for her to hear. She never answered, just gave the mules a pat and looped the chain for the next pull. The boy arrived in the second month. His name was Finn, a pale, silent child of about 10 who was known in town as a bit soft in the head. He would appear at the edge of the clearing and just watch, his eyes fixed on the mules. Ilara ignored him at first, but he was as persistent as the kudzu itself. One day he stepped forward as she was struggling to untangle the chain from a snarl of roots. He didn't speak, just knelt and worked his small, nimble fingers into the knot. It came free. Ilara looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He just nodded, his gaze returning to the mules. From then on, he was a fixture. He would carry water, brush down the great beasts at the end of the day, and sit quietly while Ilara ate her supper of cold biscuits and beans. He rarely spoke, but he listened, and his presence was a small, warm stone against the wall of her solitude. By the first frost, they had cleared nearly 2 acres. It was a laughable patch against the backdrop of the whole valley, a tiny bite out of a green whale, but it was theirs. It was land. She had found the bones of the old farmhouse, a collapsed chimney stack and a rectangle of foundation stones, choked and fractured by the relentless roots. She and Finn spent a week clearing them, prying the stones free and stacking them into a neat wall that marked the boundary of their progress. It was on one of those days, levering a heavy cornerstone from the earth, that her pry bar struck something different. Not the dull thud of dirt or the grating scrape of rock, but a clean ringing sound. Metal on dressed stone. A thrill, cold and sharp, went through her. She had been listening as Mr. Anselm had advised, and she had heard something. "Finn," she called, her voice low, "bring the spade." Together they began to dig. The earth was soft and loamy under the kudzu mat, soil that hadn't seen the sun in decades. An hour of careful work revealed the edge of a flat, circular stone, perfectly level and impossibly large. It was granite, but not the rough fieldstone of the foundation. This was cut, shaped. Its surface was scored with a shallow, circular groove. Day after day, as the weather grew colder, they expanded their excavation. The town forgot about her. The folly was old news and winter chores were pressing. Her isolation became a shield. No one came to watch, to mock, to ask questions. It was just her, the boy, and the mules, uncovering their secret. The circular stone proved to be the top of a basin nearly 10 feet across. From its center rose the broken housing of a great iron gearworks, and beside it, half buried like a fallen god, lay the press screw, a cider press, an old, massive, horse-powered cider press. It was what the land remembered. Mr. Anselm came a week later, drawn by a curiosity he could no longer contain. He stood at the edge of the pit, his eyes tracing the lines of the stonework. He walked around it, touching the chiseled edges, running a thumb along the deep channel meant to carry the juice. "Yeah," he breathed, his voice full of reverence. "This is the old way. From the old country, maybe. Look at the fit of the stones. No mortar. Just weight and skill." He knelt and examined the press screw. The iron is pitted but sound. The wood is gone, the housing is cracked. But the heart is strong. He looked at Alara, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something like pride in his eyes. "You listened," he said. It was the highest praise he could give. The knowledge of the press became a fire banked low against the winter cold. It was a promise. The arithmetic of survival, which she calculated each night by the light of her small lantern, began to change. Before, it had been a simple equation of dwindling funds against the cost of salt pork and flour. Now a new variable entered the ledger. Possibility. The work shifted. Clearing the kudzu was no longer just about reclaiming land. It was about feeding the press. She began to look at the green monster differently. Where she had seen an enemy, she now saw a protector. For what had the kudzu been covering all these years? Finn was the one who found the first one. He had wandered deeper into the vine-choked woods that bordered the clearing, following the frantic chatter of a squirrel. He came running back, his eyes wide, holding a small, gnarled, impossibly bitter apple. Ilara followed him back to a place where the kudzu hung in thick, draping curtains from the branches of ancient trees. And there they were, an orchard, not a tidy, planted orchard, but a wild scattering of old giants, their trunks wrapped in vine, their limbs contorted from their long fight for light. They were survivors. The kudzu, in its smothering embrace, had protected them from blight, from deer, from the axes of men who would have cleared them for pasture. It had held them in a green sleep. The winter was a time of quiet industry. While the kudzu slept under a thin blanket of snow, Ilara and Mr. Anselm undertook the delicate surgery of restoring the press. He was a master of forgotten skills, a man who knew the language of iron and stone. He showed her how to build a small, fiercely hot forge, using the stones from the fallen chimney. He taught her how to heat the cracked iron housing until it glowed cherry red, and then, with careful rhythmic blows of a sledgehammer, to coax the metal back into its proper shape. It was work that required more patience than strength, a deep understanding of how metal would yield and when it would break. Ilara learned quickly, her steady hands and quiet focus perfectly suited to the task. While they worked on the iron, Finn was given a different job. Armed with a small hatchet and a saw, he was sent into the sleeping orchard. His task was not to clear it, but to prune it with a surgeon's care. Find the living wood, Ilara instructed him, showing him how to spot the thin, pale green layer of cambium beneath the bark. Cut away only what is dead. The vine has starved them, so we must not shock them. We are waking them up, not shouting at them. The boy, who struggled to follow simple instructions in the schoolhouse, understood this language instinctively. He moved through the gnarled trees like a whisper, his small saw singing a soft song, freeing the living branches from their dead and strangled kin. By March, as the first green shoots of the kudzu began to reappear, the press was whole again. The great screw, cleaned of its rust and coated in tallow, turned smoothly in its repaired housing. Mr. Anselm had fashioned a new sweep arm from a seasoned oak he had kept in his barn for 20 years, waiting for a purpose worthy of its strength. It was a beautiful thing, curved and powerful, and when they fitted it to the press, it felt as though a bone had been set back into its socket. The town remained oblivious. Ilara's folly was a winter memory, and spring planting was on everyone's mind. The rains that year were late, and the sun had a hard, glassy edge to it, even in April. The older farmers sniffed the air and looked at the sky with worried eyes. The creek that ran through Ilara's property, the one she had uncovered from the kudzu, was running lower than it should. She noted it in her mental ledger. Another small piece of arithmetic. She and Finn began the spring clearing with a new urgency. They weren't just taking back land anymore. They were liberating the trees. As they cleared the ground around each ancient apple, they discovered the kudzu had done another favor. Its thick mat had preserved the topsoil, preventing the erosion that had stripped so much of the surrounding hill country. The earth was dark, rich, and alive, and the trees, freed from their bondage, responded. They exploded in a riot of blossoms, a cloud of pink and white against the grim green of the vine. It was a sight of such fierce, defiant beauty that it made Ilara's chest ache. It was a promise of a harvest. The town, however, saw only the kudzu. When the spring rains finally failed to arrive in May, and the corn in the fields began to look stunted and pale, their mockery took on a sharper edge, the kind born of anxiety. Mr. Sterling, riding his fine horse past her property line, saw her and Finn resetting a fallen section of stone wall. "Still playing in the dirt, Miss Kane?" he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "You'd be better off praying for rain. When this drought hits proper, that vine of yours will be the only thing left alive in this county. And you can't eat vine." Ilara placed a stone carefully, checking its level. She didn't look at him. "The mules seem to like it well enough," she said, her voice calm and even. It was a simple statement of fact, but it silenced him. He stared for a moment at the two great, healthy beasts standing placidly in the shade, their coats sleek and their bellies full. They were in better condition than any of the horses or cattle in the valley. He grunted and rode on, but a seed of a new idea had been planted in his mind. A thing's only worth is what others will pay, and soon people might be willing to pay for anything that was green. By June, the drought had a name and a personality. It was a cruel, silent visitor that sat on the horizon, sucking the moisture from the air and the hope from men's hearts. The corn tasseled at half its normal height before turning a brittle, ghostly white. The creeks slowed to a trickle, then to a series of stagnant, algae-choked pools. The pastures browned and crisped, and the cattle stood listlessly, their ribs beginning to show. The only vibrant color in the entire landscape was the defiant, impossible green of Ilara's valley. The kudzu, with its deep taproots reaching down to the hidden water tables, thrived. It grew with an almost malevolent vigor, a green monument to the failure all around it. The town's perception began its slow, painful reversal. What had been a symbol of worthlessness was becoming a symbol of survival. The laughter stopped. In its place grew a quiet, resentful envy. They had mocked her for buying a problem, and now her problem was the only thing that seemed immune to God's judgment. Sterling was the first to act on it. He arrived one sweltering afternoon, not on his horse, but in a dusty buggy, trying to project an air of businesslike concern. He found Ilara by the creek, reinforcing a small stone dam she and Finn had built to create a deep pool for the mules. "Miss Kane," he began, removing his hat and wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "A difficult time for the county." "It is," she agreed, not pausing in her work of chinking mud and stones into a gap. "I've been thinking about your situation here. A woman alone, with all this fodder." He gestured vaguely at the sea of green. "My own cattle are suffering, as are my neighbors. I would be willing, as a service to the community, to purchase the cutting rights to your vine. $1 an acre. It's more than fair considering it's a nuisance." Ilara straightened up and looked at him. The sun was fierce, but her eyes were cool. She knew the arithmetic. $1 an acre for 110 acres was $110. It was more money than she had seen in a year. But she also knew the arithmetic of his desperation. His 300 acres of prime corn were now 300 acres of tinder. His herd of 50 cattle was a collection of walking skeletons. "It's not for sale, Mr. Sterling," she said. His smile tightened. "Perhaps you misunderstand. This isn't a negotiation. The town council has empowered me to make arrangements for emergency fodder. If you are unwilling to be reasonable—" "I'm not a member of your community, Mr. Sterling," she reminded him quietly. "Your council has no power here. This is my land." She had never spoken with such authority, and the sound of her own voice surprised her. It felt solid, rooted, like the stones she was setting. "But my mules must eat," she continued, her voice softening slightly. "And I find I have a surplus. I will sell hay. $5 a wagon load. You cut it, you haul it. You pay in cash at the gate." Sterling's face went purple. $5 a load was an outrageous price, a price born of monopoly. It was a price he himself would have charged, had the positions been reversed. "That's robbery," he sputtered. "No," Ilara said, turning back to her dam. "It's the price. Take it or leave it." He stood there for a long moment, his fury warring with his desperation. He looked from her back to the healthy mules to the endless taunting green. Finally, he spun on his heel and stomped back to his buggy. "You'll regret this, woman," he shouted over his shoulder. "There are other ways. The town needs that fodder." Ilara watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She had won the skirmish, but she knew he was right. The town did need it, and a hungry town was a dangerous thing. The crisis had arrived, and it wore the face of her neighbors. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The drought held the valley in its fist, and the air grew thick with dust and despair. The first cattle began to die. A sullen, watchful quiet fell over the community. People's faces grew pinched and wary. Ilara felt the change in the way they looked at her when she went to the Crossroads store for supplies. The scorn was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a hungry, calculating stare. She, Finn, and Mr. Anselm worked with a quiet, frantic energy. The apples, small and hard from the lack of rain, were ripening on the trees. Their flavor, however, was intensely concentrated, a perfect blend of sugar and acid. They harvested by moonlight when the air was cool and the world was asleep. They filled basket after basket, the gnarled fruits feeling like jewels in their hands. They worked in near silence, the only sounds the soft thud of apples into the baskets and the call of a nightjar. They were banking their secret, hoarding their hope against the coming reckoning. During the day, Ilara sold the kudzu hay. One by one, her neighbors came, their pride scraped raw, their wagons rattling and empty. She held to her price, $5 a load. It was not a cruel price, but a fair one. It was the price of her labor, of her foresight, of the $60 she had paid when they had all laughed. She kept a careful ledger, marking down each sale. Some paid in cash. Others, like the widow Hemmings, whose 2 milk cows were all she had, she allowed to buy on credit, a decision that baffled and annoyed those who paid. She was not gouging, but she was not giving it away either. She was teaching them the value they had been too blind to see. Sterling did not come back. Instead, he began to work on the town. He was a man who knew how to turn fear into a weapon. He spoke in whispers in the store, in solemn tones at the church gathering. He spoke of the common good. He spoke of a lone woman hoarding a resource while the community starved. He spoke of selfishness and pride. He never used the word seize, but it hung in the air after he passed, a greasy smoke. He called a town meeting. The notice, nailed to the door of the meeting hall, was stark. To discuss the fair allocation of emergency resources for the common welfare. Everyone knew it was about Ilara and her kudzu. Mr. Anselm brought her the news. He found her and Finn turning the great screw of the press, crushing the first load of apples. The smell was intoxicating, a sharp, sweet perfume of autumn in the midst of the punishing summer. The dark, fragrant juice trickled down the stone channel into a waiting barrel. "He means to take it, Ilara," the old man said, his voice grave. "He will use their fear against you. They are good people, but hunger makes people forget their goodness." Ilara watched the dark juice flow. She thought of the mockery, the condescension, the loneliness. She could let them fight. She could stand on her rights, on the deed in her trunk. One person alone. That was how Sterling saw her. That was how they all saw her. It was not, she realized, how she saw herself. She had the Mules and Finn and Mr. Anselm, and she had the press. "What time is the meeting?" she asked, her voice steady. He told her. She nodded, a plan forming in her mind. A plan made not of anger or revenge, but of cider and vinegar. She would meet their fear not with defiance, but with abundance. It was a risk, a wild gamble that they would remember their goodness when they tasted it. It was the final, most important piece of arithmetic she would ever do. The town meeting hall was packed, every bench full, men standing along the walls. The air was thick with heat, sweat, and a low, simmering anger. It was the anger of proud men forced to face their own failure. Their fields were dust, their barns were emptying, and the only success for miles belonged to the woman they had called a fool. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Sterling stood at the front, looking solemn and important. He let the silence stretch, letting their anxiety build. He spoke of shared hardship, of neighborly duty. of the pioneer spirit that called for sacrifice for the greater good. He painted a picture of communal survival, and at its center was a single, unavoidable obstacle: Elira Kane's selfishness. "This is not about property," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "It is about life, about the survival of our community's livestock, and thus our community itself. We cannot allow one person's stubbornness to endanger us all. The council proposes that we declare the kudzu on the hemlock parcel a public resource to be harvested and distributed fairly under my supervision. The owner will be compensated, of course, at the fair market rate of $1 an acre." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a legal-sounding theft, and they knew it. But their need was a powerful argument. A few men nodded. It seemed reasonable. It seemed necessary. Just as Sterling was about to call for a vote, the main doors at the back of the hall creaked open. Everyone turned. Elira stood there, silhouetted against the dying light. She was not alone. Behind her stood Mr. Anselm and the boy, Finn, and between them, on a small handcart, were two small wooden barrels. The crowd parted silently as she made her way to the front. She did not look at Sterling. She addressed the assembled town. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a new weight, a quiet authority that commanded their attention. "I hear you're discussing my property," she began. "You are worried. Your animals are hungry. I understand." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Some of you have come to me to buy fodder. You paid a fair price for it. I thank you. Some of you could not pay, and I have extended you credit. I trust you." She looked directly at the widow Hemmings, who flushed but met her gaze with gratitude. "Mr. Sterling believes the kudzu is the most valuable thing I have. He is mistaken." With a nod to Finn, she opened the tap on the first barrel. She filled a small tin cup and handed it to the farmer nearest her, a man named Peters, who had been one of her loudest mockers. "This is cider," she said, "made from the apples the kudzu protected." Peters sniffed it suspiciously and then took a tentative sip. His eyes widened. He took a deeper drink, the sounds of his swallowing loud in the silent room. "My God," he whispered. He passed the cup to the man next to him. A low buzz started as the cup made its way through the crowd, each person's reaction the same: surprise, then pleasure, then a dawning understanding. Elira tapped the second barrel. "And this," she said, filling another cup, "is apple vinegar, for preserving what little harvest you managed to bring in, or for a husband's sour temper." A few nervous chuckles broke the tension. "The hay is for sale," she announced, "at the price I set. The cider is also for sale, 10 cents a gallon. The vinegar is 5 cents. For those who cannot pay, I will trade for work. There is much to be done. A new barn to be raised, an orchard to be cleared." She finally turned to Sterling, her gaze level and clear. "My farm is not a public resource, Mr. Sterling. It is a business, and it is open for business to any honest neighbor." The silence that followed was profound. It was the sound of 100 private calculations, of shame and respect wrestling in the hearts of proud men. They had come ready to condemn a hoarder, and instead had been offered a partnership. They had looked at her land and seen only a problem to be solved with force. She had looked at it and found a solution that nourished. The spell of Sterling's fear-mongering was broken. Into the quiet, a new voice spoke. It belonged to a traveling merchant, a man from the city who bought produce and goods throughout the county and who had been sitting quietly at the back. He had tasted the cider. "Ma'am," he said, standing up, "I'll buy every barrel of that cider you can make, and I'll pay you 25 cents a gallon for it, delivered to the railhead." The collective gasp was audible. It was a fortune. It was validation from the outside world, a judgment that could not be questioned. Ilara considered his offer for a moment. Then she shook her head. "No, thank you," she said. "The town has first claim. At 10 cents. Whatever is left, you may have at your price." That single act sealed it. It was not about profit. It was about community. It was a generosity so unexpected, so contrary to the harsh arithmetic of their own fears, that it shamed them. It was a lesson taught without a word of reproach. Sterling stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. His authority had evaporated. He had offered them a legal theft that would have benefited him most of all, and she had offered them affordable abundance and shared work. He had miscalculated her completely. He had seen a lone woman and assumed she was weak. He had failed to see the strength that came from patience, from listening to the land, from understanding true value. A farmer near the back, a man who had not yet spoken, cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice rough, "you said you were empowered by the council to make arrangements. My brother-in-law is on the council. He says they never discussed it. Said it was your idea alone." All eyes turned to Sterling. He sputtered, his face draining of color, then turning a blotchy red. He had overplayed his hand, certain of his power, certain of their fear. He had been exposed not by Ilara's accusation, but by her quiet competence. He turned without another word and pushed his way through the crowd, which parted for him with a new cold contempt. He was a man who had tried to weaponize their hunger against a neighbor, and they would not soon forget it. The meeting dissolved not with a vote, but with the quiet scraping of benches. Men shuffled forward, not with anger, but with a humbled curiosity. They crowded around the barrels, their talk now of apple varieties, of the cost of barrels, of the work needed to clear an orchard. They spoke to her as an equal, as a peer, as someone who had seen what they had missed. That night, the first real rain in 3 months began to fall. It was a soft, steady, soaking rain that smelled of dust and relief. It drummed on the roof of the meeting hall, a gentle applause for a victory won not with arguments, but with the simple, honest weight of a thing well made. Ilara, Finn, and Mr. Anselm walked home under the clean-washed stars, the empty barrels rattling softly on the cart. The land was drinking it in, and for the first time, she felt she was no longer a woman alone on a piece of scorned earth. She was part of a place that was beginning to remember itself. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of Ilara's life changed. She still rose before the sun, but she was no longer alone. At dawn, there would be a wagon or two waiting at her gate. Men who had once mocked her now came to buy hay, their money held out with a quiet respect. Or they came to work off a debt, their axes and saws ready. They helped her and Finn clear the kudzu from around the remaining apple trees, their powerful swings making short work of the thickest vines. They marveled at the size of the old trees, at the richness of the soil the vine had protected. They were rediscovering their own history, a history that had been hidden in plain sight. Under Ilara's quiet direction, they began to raise a new barn on the foundation of the old one. Mr. Anselm, acting as foreman, directed the work with the precision of an old-world craftsman. The men, accustomed to slapdash construction, learned the satisfaction of a perfectly fitted joint, of a wall that was truly plumb. They were not just building a barn for Ilara. They were rebuilding the trust that had been frayed by the drought and by their own fear. The frightened neighbor, a man named Garvey, whose farm bordered Sterling's, came one evening after dusk, his shame a palpable weight around him. He had been one of Sterling's most vocal supporters at the meeting. "Miss Kane," he mumbled, twisting his hat in his hands, I have 2 sick cows. The vet says it's from eating bitterweed. They won't touch the dry pasture. I don't have $5 for hay." Ilara looked at him, at his worried, tired face. She saw not an enemy, but a man pushed to the edge by hardship. "The vinegar is good for sick cattle," she said gently. "Mix it with their water. It settles the stomach." She went into her small cabin and came back with a heavy jug. "Take this, and a load of hay. Pay me when you can, after your own family has eaten." Garvey looked at the jug as if it were a miracle. He could not meet her eyes. "I don't know why you'd be so decent to me," he whispered. "Because a debt is a chain," Ilara said simply. "And I'd rather have a neighbor than a prisoner. Go see to your cows." The cider press became the new heart of the valley. Its rhythmic creak and groan as the mules turned the sweep was a constant, reassuring sound. The scent of pressed apples hung in the air, a sweet promise of sustenance and preservation. The children, Finn foremost among them, loved to watch the process, their eyes wide as the dark juice streamed from the stone channel. She named the mules who helped her, one calm and steady, the other stubborn and strong. The child, Finn gave them names that stuck: Salt and Pepper. Salt, the lighter mule, would lean into the sweep with a placid patience, his gait never varying. Pepper, the darker one, would pull with a focused intensity, his great muscles bunching. They seemed to understand their new purpose, their dignity restored. They were no longer just instruments for clearing a nuisance. They were partners in creation, their strength turning forgotten fruit into liquid gold. The entire flock of children began to name the animals, the trees, the parts of the press, weaving the folly back into the fabric of the community's story. The vindication was not a loud, gloating thing. It was quiet, like the slow greening of the pastures after the rain. It was in the way people nodded to her at the store. It was in the taste of her cider at a barn raising, in the sharp, clean scent of her vinegar in their pantries. She had proven not just that she was right, but that a different kind of arithmetic was possible, one where patience counted for more than speed, and where generosity was a wiser investment than greed. Sterling's fortunes continued to decline. His fields, plowed and exposed, had lost much of their topsoil to the wind during the drought. The rain, when it came, carved deep gullies into his land. His cattle, weakened by hunger, were slow to recover. He had gambled on a single vulnerable crop and lost. Ilara, who had started with what everyone considered worthless, had built her success on diversity and resilience, on the deep-rooted vine, the hardy old trees, and the forgotten stone press. She had looked for value where no one else had bothered to see it. One crisp autumn afternoon, the merchant from the city returned, his wagon loaded with empty barrels. He bought what cider was left after the town had taken its share, and he paid her price without haggling. As they loaded the barrels, he looked around at the cleared valley, the new barn rising, the smoke curling from the cabin chimney. "You've done a remarkable thing here, ma'am," he said. "Everyone said this place was cursed." Ilara ran a hand over Salt's broad, steady back. "The land is never cursed," she said, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of a hard-won truth. "Sometimes it's just forgotten." Mr. Anselm, who had been watching from the porch of his own cabin, walked over. He looked at the valley, at the mules, and Ilara standing straight and secure in the place she had made her own. He nodded slowly, a deep satisfaction in his old eyes. "The land remembers what it was meant to be," he said, repeating the words he had spoken to her 2 years before. "You only had to be quiet enough to listen." Ilara watched the merchant's wagon rattle away down the road, carrying her cider out into the wider world. Finn stood beside her, no longer a stray silent boy, but a confident apprentice who knew the name of every tree in the orchard. The mules, Salt and Pepper, stood placidly, their day's work done. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and apples. The arithmetic of her life was no longer about mere survival. It was about abundance. It was about the deep, quiet joy of a thing restored, a promise kept, a home earned not with money but with the slow, patient, and victorious work of her own two hands. The folly had become a foundation, and she was, at last, no longer a woman alone.